In the company of the brilliant Hercule Poirot, I have delved into many strange and baffling cases, but none, I dare say, comes close to the chilling enigma of the cursed heirloom. This wasn't just a case, it was an intricate web of mystery that unraveled over the years, eventually leading us to a problem that tested Poirot's genius to its limits. It all began on an ordinary evening during the war. Poirot and I had reunited after a long time, rekindling memories of our old adventures together. He had recently concluded a delicate assignment for the War Office with his characteristic flair, earning high praise from a top official. Over dinner at the Carlton, Poirot basked in the accolades, while I couldn't help but marvel at his calm composure, as though compliments were no more than passing pleasantries to him. As the evening progressed and the bustling dining room began to clear, a familiar voice called out my name. Turning, I was greeted by Captain Vincent Lemessurier, a young officer I'd known briefly during my time in France. Beside him stood a man who bore such a striking resemblance to him that their kinship was undeniable. Vincent introduced him as his uncle, Hugo Lemessurier. Vincent was the kind of person you'd label as a dreamer. Pleasant, but with an air of detachment, as though his mind often wandered to far-off places. His family, I'd heard, was steeped in history. Aristocrats with roots tracing back to pre-Reformation England. Hugo, on the other hand, had the appearance of a scholar, his slightly stooped shoulders hinting at long hours spent in study. Just as we were settling into a pleasant conversation, an abrupt interruption shattered the calm. A tall, dark young man approached the table, his face tense with urgency. "Thank goodness I found you both," he exclaimed, directing his words to Vincent. The message he delivered was grim. Vincent's father had suffered a terrible accident, a fall while riding a young horse, and his condition was dire. The news left Vincent pale and visibly shaken. His reaction surprised me, for he had once hinted at a strained relationship with his father. But now, his face betrayed nothing but shock and anguish. The dark-haired man, introduced as Roger Lemessurier, stayed behind as Vincent and his uncle hurriedly departed. Roger, a curious figure himself, remarked with a peculiar glint in his eye, "This would interest your friend, Monsieur Poirot. A family curse, they say. Would you care to hear it?" Poirot leaned forward slightly, his interest piqued. "A family curse, you say? Do continue." Roger didn't need further encouragement. He recounted the tale of the Lemessurier curse, a dark legend steeped in medieval intrigue. Centuries ago, a Lemessurier patriarch, Baron Hugo, had accused his wife of infidelity. In a fit of rage, he had condemned both her and their son to a gruesome fate, swearing the boy was no heir of his. The wife, before her death, cursed the family, vowing that no firstborn Lemessurier would ever inherit their ancestral estate. The curse, Roger claimed, had held true for generations. Eldest sons had either perished or been bypassed, leaving the inheritance to younger siblings or distant relatives. Vincent's father himself was the second of 5 brothers, the eldest having died in infancy. And now, with Vincent's father on his deathbed, the curse seemed poised to rear its head once more. "Do you believe the curse is real?" I asked, half-jokingly, trying to lighten the mood. Roger smirked. "Curses are relics of a bygone age, aren't they? Perhaps this one has finally run out of steam." But there was something in his tone, something unsettling, as though he wasn't entirely convinced of his own words. The next morning, the chilling sequel to the tale unfolded. News reached us that Captain Vincent Lemessurier had died tragically while traveling north. In the dead of night, he had opened the train compartment door and plunged to his death. The curse of the Lemessurier had claimed yet another victim, or had it? Was this truly the work of an ancient malediction, or was there something far more sinister at play? As always, Poirot remained calm, his sharp mind already dissecting the fragments of this dark puzzle. A family curse, mon ami, or merely the psychology of fear, playing a cruel trick on the mind? We shall see. And so, the mystery deepened, pulling us into the shadowy depths of the Le Mesurier legacy, where secrets long buried refused to stay hidden. The shock of Vincent Le Mesurier's father's accident, compounded by the lingering effects of shell shock from the war, was deemed enough to drive the young man into a state of temporary insanity. But was it truly madness, or something far darker? The legend of the Le Mesurier family curse loomed ominously over this tragedy. With Vincent gone, the inheritance passed to his uncle, Ronald Le Mesurier, whose own son had tragically fallen in battle during the Somme. It was as though fate, or some unseen force, was systematically erasing the family's firstborn heirs. 2 years after Vincent's death, the curse struck again. Ronald, frail and ailing, succumbed to his long-standing illness. The estate passed to his brother John, a robust man with every sign of good health and a promising future for his family. Yet, even John wasn't spared. During a holiday, John's young son, an energetic boy fresh from Eton, met an untimely death, an accidental gunshot that left the family reeling. And as if that weren't enough, John himself perished suddenly, the cause an allergic reaction to a simple wasp sting. The estate, cursed and blood-stained, found its way to the youngest of the 5 brothers, Hugo Le Mesurier, the same man Poirot and I had met years ago on that fateful night at the Carlton. At first, we thought this morbid series of events was the end of the story. A dark, sinister chapter had closed, or so it seemed, but fate had different plans. One morning, a tall, striking woman appeared at Poirot's doorstep. She carried herself with an air of determination, her faint transatlantic accent adding a certain charm to her confident demeanor. "I am Mrs. Le Mesurier," she introduced herself briskly. "You met my husband, Hugo, years ago, Monsieur Poirot. He remembers you well. But I am here today because I am worried, terribly worried." "Worried, madame?" Poirot inquired, his sharp eyes narrowing slightly. "It's about my elder son, Ronald. He's only 8 years old, and already he's had 3 brushes with death in the past 6 months. First, he nearly drowned while we were vacationing in Cornwall. Then he fell from the nursery window. And most recently he suffered from severe ptomaine poisoning." Poirot's expression revealed what words did not. Mrs. Le Mesurier continued, almost defensively. "I know what you're thinking, Monsieur Poirot, that I'm just some over-anxious mother. But this is different. These incidents, they don't feel like accidents." Poirot tilted his head, the barest flicker of interest deepening in his gaze. "What does your husband think, madame?" "Hugo?" A shadow crossed her face. "He believes it's the family curse. You've heard of it, haven't you? The Le Mesurier curse that no firstborn son can ever inherit. Hugo's convinced there's no escaping it. But I don't believe in curses. Not really." She paused, her voice trembling slightly before she continued. "But, Monsieur Poirot, can a curse cut through an ivy stem?" Poirot leaned forward sharply, his eyes flashing with interest. "What is it you are saying, madam?" "I said, can a curse or a ghost, if you like, saw through an ivy stem?" she repeated firmly. "Let me explain. My boys discovered they could climb up and down the side of the house using the thick ivy. They loved it. One day, when my younger son Gerald was away, Ronald tried it again, but the ivy gave way. He fell. Thankfully, he wasn't badly hurt, but when I examined the ivy afterward, I found it had been deliberately cut through." The room fell silent as her words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Poirot's face darkened with thought. "Madame, this is indeed very serious. And the ptomaine poisoning. Was your younger son home when that occurred?" "Yes, both boys were there," she replied. Poirot's brow furrowed as he murmured, "Curious, very curious. Tell me, madame, who else resides in your household?" Mrs. Le Mesurier hesitated, as though weighing her words. "We have a governess for the children, 2 maids, a cook, and my husband's assistant, that's all." Poirot nodded thoughtfully, but his eyes gleamed with an intensity I recognized well. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, or perhaps they were being deliberately scattered, forcing him to sift through layers of misdirection. The curse of the Le Mesuriers had always seemed like a grim story passed down through the ages, a legend to frighten children on stormy nights. But now it felt real, too real, and for the first time it seemed that someone, or something, was determined to make sure the curse lived on. Miss Saunders, the children's governess, and John Gardiner, my husband's secretary. Mrs. Le Mesurier paused, her hesitation subtle but telling. Poirot's gaze sharpened, catching every nuance. "And who else, madame?" he prompted gently, though his voice carried the weight of his curiosity. "There is also Major Roger Le Mesurier," she admitted, her tone faltering slightly. "You may recall meeting him that night as well. He stays with us quite often." "Ah, yes," Poirot murmured. "He is a cousin, is he not?" "A distant cousin," she clarified quickly. "He's not part of our branch of the family. But now, I suppose, he is Hugo's closest relative. He's a dear fellow, charming, really. We're all fond of him. The boys adore him." Poirot leaned forward slightly, his expression calm but probing. "It wasn't by chance, madam, that he taught the boys how to climb the ivy?" She hesitated, then smiled wryly. "It might have been. Roger is always encouraging them to get into mischief, but he means no harm." Poirot straightened, his tone softening with unexpected gravity. "Madam, I must apologize for my earlier dismissal. The danger to your son is real, and I believe I can help. If you agree, I propose that my companion and I come to stay with you for a while." Mrs. Le Mesurier's eyes lit up with relief, though doubt flickered briefly across her face. "Hugo won't object, though he'll think it's pointless. It infuriates me, Monsieur Poirot, the way he just sits there, resigned, as if Ronald's fate is sealed." "Calm yourself, madame," Poirot said soothingly. "Let us proceed with logic and method. Together, we will see what is to be done." And so, the arrangements were made. By the following morning, we were on a train heading north, the landscape rushing past as Poirot sat in a pensive silence. At last he spoke, his voice quiet but deliberate. "It was from a train such as this, Hastings, that Vincent Le Mesurier fell, was it not?" He placed the faintest emphasis on the word fell. "You don't suspect foul play there, surely?" I asked, startled by his tone. Poirot's lips pressed into a thin line. "Consider it, mon ami. Several of these so-called accidents, the death of Vincent, the boy at Eton, could they not have been arranged? An accident with a gun is always ambiguous. A fall from a nursery window, tragic, yes, but natural enough to evade suspicion. But who stands to gain from such a pattern of deaths? A 7-year-old boy, the younger brother? Impossible, absurd. Then, perhaps they mean to eliminate him later?" I ventured, though my words felt hollow even as I spoke them. Poirot shook his head, dissatisfied with my suggestion. "No, Hastings, there is something else at work here, and the podomaine poisoning, does that not strike you as peculiar? Atropine poisoning mimics similar symptoms, you know." "Yes, mon cher, I fear our presence in that house is not just necessary, it is urgent." When we arrived, Mrs. Le Mesurier greeted us warmly, her gratitude evident. She wasted no time ushering us into Hugo Le Mesurier's study. Hugo, the once vigorous man I remembered, had changed drastically. His shoulders stooped under an invisible weight, and his complexion had taken on a sickly, ashen pallor. As Poirot explained our visit, Hugo listened silently, his eyes distant, his face etched with weariness. "How very like Sadie's practical common sense," he murmured finally. "Stay as long as you wish, Monsieur Poirot. I thank you for coming, but it will do no good. What is written is written. The way of the transgressor is hard, and we Le Mesurier, none of us can escape our doom." Poirot brought up the sawn through ivy, but Hugo waved it off with a weary hand. "Some careless gardener, perhaps. An instrument, yes, but the hand behind it is irrelevant. The purpose remains clear, and the time is close at hand." Poirot's eyes gleamed with intensity. "Why do you say that?" "Because I am dying, Monsieur Poirot," Hugo replied matter-of-factly. "The doctors confirmed it last year, an incurable disease. The end is near. But before I go, Ronald will be taken. The curse will see to it. And if by chance something were to happen to your younger son," Poirot pressed. Hugo's face darkened. "Nothing will happen to Gerald. He is not marked. If he were, Roger would inherit. But it won't come to that." Before Poirot could respond, the door swung open, and a tall, striking man entered, holding a stack of papers. His auburn curls gleamed in the sunlight streaming through the windows, and his presence carried an air of self-assuredness. "Not now, Gardner," Hugo said dismissively. "My secretary," he added, glancing at us. Gardner offered a courteous bow, but there was something about him that made my skin crawl. His polished manners felt too rehearsed, his charm too deliberate. Once he had left, I turned to Poirot. "There's something off about that man," I said bluntly. Poirot nodded, surprising me. "Out, Hastings, you are correct. He is too good-looking, too smooth. Such men often seek soft paths in life, and they tread those paths lightly, but not always innocently." At that moment, Mrs. Le Mesurier appeared in the garden, walking toward us with her 2 sons. The boys were handsome children. Ronald, with his auburn curls, was the spitting image of his father, while Gerald had his mother's dark hair and lively eyes. As they drew closer, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that we were walking into a house where shadows lingered too long and secrets whispered too loudly. The introductions continued. The children shook hands with Poirot with a mix of shyness and curiosity, quickly warming to his peculiar charm. Soon they were utterly devoted to him, laughing at his gentle jests and clinging to his every word. We were then introduced to Miss Saunders, a woman so plain and unremarkable that it was almost as if the air around her grew duller. She smiled faintly, murmuring pleasantries before retreating into the background like a shadow that neither added nor subtracted from the scene. The following days passed peacefully, almost deceptively so. The boys carried on with their spirited games, their laughter echoing across the grounds. Everything appeared normal. Too normal, perhaps. Poirot's sharp eyes missed nothing, yet the veil of innocence remained unbroken. On the 4th day, Major Roger Le Mesurier arrived. He swept into the house with the easy confidence of a man who belonged wherever he went. Still carefree, still charming, he radiated an air of detached amusement, as though the weight of the family's supposed curse was nothing more than an old wives' tale. The boys, however, treated him like a hero. Their delighted screams echoed through the garden as they dragged him off to play wild Indians. Poirot, ever watchful, slipped into the garden as well, his presence unnoticed. The next day, Lady Claygate, the Le Mesurier's neighbor, invited everyone over for tea. Mrs. Le Mesurier suggested that Poirot and I join, but he declined, claiming he preferred to stay at home. I couldn't help but notice her subtle relief at his refusal. Once the family departed, Poirot sprang into action. He transformed, moving through the house with the relentless energy of a hunting dog. No corner was left unsearched, no detail overlooked. It was methodical, yet silent, like a shadow flitting from room to room. But by the time the family returned, his expression told me all I needed to know. He hadn't found what he was looking for. Later, as we sat on the terrace with Miss Saunders, she spoke in her faint, listless voice. "The boys will have enjoyed themselves," she murmured. "I only hope they behaved and stayed away from the flower beds and the bees." "Bees?" Poirot, in the midst of drinking his tea, froze mid-sip. His face turned pale, his eyes wide, as if he had been struck by an invisible blow. "Yes," Miss Saunders said, blinking at his reaction. "Lady Claygate has 3 hives. She's very proud of her bees." "Bees?" Poirot repeated, his voice sharper this time. He stood abruptly, pacing the terrace with his hands pressed to his temples. He looked like a man trying to piece together a puzzle whose final image had just revealed itself. Before I could question him further, the sound of an approaching car broke the tension. The family had returned. Poirot was on the doorstep in an instant, waiting for them to alight. "Ronald's been stung," Gerald cried, his voice brimming with excitement. "It's nothing," Mrs. Le Mesurier reassured us. "It didn't even swell. We put ammonia on it." Poirot crouched in front of Ronald, his expression unreadable. "Let me see, mon petit," he said softly. "Where were you stung?" Ronald puffed up his chest, speaking with the pride of a soldier recounting a battle wound. "Here, on my neck," he said, pointing. "It didn't really hurt, though. Father told me to keep still because there was a bee on me. He took it off, but it stung me first. I didn't cry. I'm too big for that." Poirot examined the small mark on the boy's neck with the intensity of a jeweler inspecting a rare gem. Then he rose, his face grim. "Tonight, Hastings," he murmured as we stepped aside. "Tonight we have work to do. Say nothing to anyone." His cryptic remark left me on edge for the rest of the evening. He retired early and I followed his lead. As I prepared for bed, Poirot caught my arm. "Do not undress," he instructed. "Extinguish your light, wait, and then join me here." I did as he asked, creeping into the dim hallway an hour later. Poirot was waiting, his finger pressed to his lips. Together, we moved silently to the nursery wing, where Ronald slept in his small room. Inside, the child lay peacefully, his breathing slow and heavy. Too heavy. "Surely he's sleeping unusually deeply," I whispered. Poirot nodded grimly. "Drugged," he murmured. "Why?" I asked, a chill running down my spine. "So he will not cry out," Poirot said, his voice barely audible, "at the prick of the hypodermic needle." The words froze the blood in my veins. Hardly 10 minutes had passed when the door creaked open. A shadow slipped into the room, moving with deliberate care. The sound of quick, shallow breaths filled the air. Then came the faint click of an electric lantern. A beam of light fell on Ronald's sleeping face, illuminating the hand that reached into the shadow, a hand clutching a syringe. Poirot and I moved as one, leaping from our hiding place. The lantern clattered to the floor as we grappled with the intruder. The struggle was fierce, the man's strength was shocking. But at last, we subdued him. "The light, Hastings," Poirot barked. "Quickly, I must see his face, though I fear I already know whose it will be." So did I. My mind raced as I fumbled for the lantern. The secretary, No, that was too obvious. It had to be someone who stood to gain everything from the deaths of these children. I found the lantern and flicked it on. The light fell on the intruder's face, and I staggered back in disbelief. Hugo le Mesurier, the boy's father. The lantern nearly slipped from my hands. "Impossible," I choked. "It can't be." Hugo was unconscious, his body slack in our grip. Poirot and I carried him to his room, laying him gently on the bed. Poirot bent down, prying something from Hugo's limp fingers. He held it up, a hypodermic syringe. I shuddered, my entire being chilled to the bone. "What is in it?" I managed to whisper. "Poison?" "Formic acid, I fancy," Poirot replied, his voice a shade darker than usual. "Formic acid?" I echoed, stunned. "Yes," Poirot said, his tone quiet but brimming with grim certainty. "Likely distilled from ants. A clever chemist could easily obtain it. Death would, of course, have been attributed to a bee sting." I stared at him, my stomach knotting in disbelief. "My God," I murmured. "His own son, and you anticipated this?" Poirot's grave nod was all the confirmation I needed. "Yes, he is mad, of course, a victim of his own deranged obsession. The family curse became his mania, his fixation." A terrible silence filled the room, pressing against my ears like a tidal wave as Poirot continued. His longing to claim the estate, at any cost, was too much for a fragile mind. Madness crept in, slowly at first, then all at once. I suspect the idea first bloomed in his mind during that fateful train ride north with Vincent. Imagine, his rage, his desperation. The prophecy haunted him. Ronald's son was dead already. Ronald himself was frail and fading. The Le Mesuriers, they were weak, and he saw a way to make their doom come true. Poirot's voice dipped, almost inaudible, as if speaking the truth aloud might summon the specter of Hugo le Mesurier. "The accident with the gun staged John's death." Poirot paused. "Also his doing, though I did not see it then. The method was the same. Formic acid injected directly into the jugular. Ingenious, horrific. And then his prize was within reach. The estate was his at last. But fate is cruel, mon ami." I could scarcely breathe. "What happened then?" Poirot met my eyes, the weight of his words making my heart pound. "He discovered he was dying, an incurable disease, and in his madness he convinced himself the curse must prevail. The eldest son of a Le Mesurier could not inherit. Madness, Hastings, methodical madness." "The bathing accident?" I ventured, my voice trembling. "Encouraged," Poirot said simply. "He likely urged the boy to swim out too far. When that failed, he sawed the ivy, and when that too fell short, he poisoned the child's food. Today, Hastings, when they returned from the Claygates and I learned there was only Hugo's word that Ronald had been stung by a bee, I knew. The truth revealed itself in that moment." I shivered. "Diabolical," I muttered. "It's also clever?" Poirot finished for me. "Yes, there is nothing more astounding than the sanity of the insane, or the eccentricity of the sane." "But Roger," I protested weakly. "He was the obvious suspect. His inheritance, his motive." Poirot waved a hand dismissively. "Too obvious, mon ami. His actions did not align with the facts. The ivy was cut when only Ronald was at home. Roger would gain nothing from just one child's death. And the poisoned food? Targeted only at Ronald. No, Roger was innocent, though it was a natural assumption to suspect him." Poirot leaned back, his expression clouded with thought. "Hugo was a man undone by his own ambition. His obsession consumed him, Hastings, until he was no longer a man, but a shadow, an echo of his own madness." I nodded, lost in the grim reality of it all. In the end, Hugo le Mesurier was confined to a private asylum, where he died a few months later. His widow, freed from his shadow, married Mr. Gardiner, the auburn-haired secretary. Little Ronald grew up to inherit the vast Le Mesurier estate, free of the curse that had hung over his family for generations. "Well," I remarked one evening to Poirot as we sat by the fire, "that's that, then, the curse of the Le Mesurier, dispelled by your little gray cells." Poirot gave me a curious look, his eyes glittering with something I couldn't quite place. "I wonder," he murmured softly. "I wonder very much indeed." "What do you mean?" I asked, leaning forward. Poirot glanced at me with a peculiar smile. "I will answer with just one word: red." My heart raced. "Blood?" I asked in a whisper. "Ah, Hastings," Poirot sighed. "Always the melodramatic imagination." "Non, mon heir, I meant the color of young Ronald Le Mesurier's hair." And with that cryptic remark, he left me to puzzle over what he truly meant. When the sleek liner SS Assunta docked at Southampton on that cold, fog-laden morning, no one could have anticipated the sinister events about to unfold. The air was thick, not just with mist, but with secrets waiting to unravel. Among the passengers disembarking was Wu Ling, a distinguished Chinese merchant on a mission that could change fortunes. He carried with him papers of immense value, documents that could reveal the location of a lost treasure, the ancient Burma mines. But within days, Wu Ling would be dead, his papers gone, and a chilling mystery would take root. It began innocently enough. Mr. Pearson, a director of the mining syndicate, was supposed to meet Wu Ling at the dock, but delays in the fog-drenched train schedule meant he arrived too late. By the time Pearson reached Southampton, Wu Ling had already taken a special train to London. Later, the syndicate received a reassuring call. Wu Ling was staying at the Russell Square Hotel and would attend their board meeting the next morning. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. When Wu Ling failed to appear at the appointed time, the company secretary called the hotel. The response was unsettling. Wu Ling had left the hotel that morning at 10:30, accompanied by an unidentified companion. Hours turned into days, and still the man was missing. Anxiety turned to dread when the police found a body floating in the murky waters of the Thames. It was Wu Ling. Enter Hercule Poirot, the famed detective, with his sharp mind and relentless pursuit of truth. Pearson, desperate to recover the papers, implored Poirot to uncover what the police might miss. "Mon cher monsieur," Poirot said with his usual calm, "to find the papers, we must first find the mind that wanted them." Poirot's first step was to retrace Wu Ling's journey. On the Assunta, Wu Ling had been a solitary figure but had formed casual acquaintances with two passengers: Dyer, a shady European with a reputation for criminal dealings, and Charles Lester, a seemingly upstanding young bank clerk with a penchant for gambling. Both men came under immediate suspicion. Dyer, with his ties to a gang of Chinese crooks, seemed like the perfect villain. But when shown Wu Ling's photograph, the staff at the Russell Square Hotel dismissed Dyer entirely. Instead, they identified the second man, Charles Lester, as the one who had called for Wu Ling that fateful morning. When Poirot and Inspector Miller questioned Lester, the young man was all too eager to cooperate. He admitted to visiting Wu Ling at the hotel, but claimed that Wu Ling's servant had intercepted him, offering to lead him to his master. Lester recounted a mysterious taxi ride through the city's fog-laden streets, during which he grew suspicious and exited abruptly, abandoning the servant and the cab. The story, delivered with perfect earnestness, might have fooled many, but not Poirot. "It is often the smallest detail that betrays the truth," Poirot mused, and betray it did. The investigation uncovered damning contradictions. For starters, Wu Ling had no servant, neither on the ship nor at the hotel. Second, the taxi driver recalled the ride clearly. He confirmed that Lester and Wu Ling had traveled together to Limehouse, a notorious district in the heart of Chinatown. They entered a squalid opium den, but only one man came out. Charles Lester. Pale, shaken, and clearly unwell, he instructed the cab driver to take him to the nearest underground station. It was a grim revelation. When questioned again, Lester fumbled for explanations. His affable facade began to crack, and soon enough the police arrested him for the murder of Wu Ling. The case seemed solved. Lester, deep in debt and addicted to gambling, had been lured by the promise of wealth. The priceless papers were still missing, but Poirot wasn't ready to close the book. "There is a piece missing from this puzzle," Poirot told Pearson. "We have found the murderer, perhaps, but we have not found the mind behind the murder." And so Poirot dug deeper. The opium den's proprietor, as expected, denied everything. No opium, no papers, no visitors that morning, just lies wrapped in Eastern stoicism. But Poirot knew better than to rely on the obvious. One evening, as he sat before the fire with Hastings, Poirot shared his theory. "Mon ami, the truth is, like a delicate thread in a spider's web. Tug at the wrong strand, and the entire pattern collapses. But pull the right one." He made a swift motion with his hand, and everything becomes clear. Poirot began piecing together what others had missed. Wu Ling's murder wasn't just about money, it was about power. Someone had orchestrated this from the shadows. Someone who knew the value of the Burma mine's secrets and had the resources to ensure those secrets stayed hidden. The case was far from over. As Poirot prepared to unveil the truth, Hastings couldn't help but ask, "But Poirot, what about the papers? Where could they be?" Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Patience, Hastings. The answer will reveal itself in due time. But remember this, the greatest treasures are often hidden in plain sight. For instance," Poirot said with a glint in his eyes, "there is the taxi driver. We have only his word that he drove the two men to that house in Limehouse. But think, mon ami, what if it wasn't their true destination? Perhaps they passed through the house, out another exit, and vanished into the foggy streets of London. A house like that could be the perfect decoy, no?" Mr. Pearson looked startled, his eyes lighting up with the idea. "That's actually plausible. But you're sitting here just thinking. Shouldn't we be doing something?" Poirot's expression turned dignified as he adjusted his tie. "Monsieur, Hercule Poirot does not run through the evil-smelling streets of Limehouse like a little dog chasing its tail. Number one must think. Be calm. My agents are already at work." The next day, Poirot had news. His sharp mind had struck gold. "The two men," he announced, "did indeed pass through the Limehouse house, but their true destination was a small, discreet eating house near the river. They were seen entering. Only Charles Lester came out." Pearson's agitation grew, and he made a sudden, outlandish suggestion. "We need to go there, you and I, disguise ourselves. I'll pretend to be a sailor, and you could shave off your mustache." The room fell silent as Poirot's face froze, scandalized. "Shave off my mustache?" he echoed, horrified. "Monsieur, one does not destroy such a thing of beauty without reason. A Belgian gentleman with a mustache may desire opium and adventure just as much as one without. Let us not be ridiculous." Pearson gave a sheepish laugh but refused to back down. That evening he returned in full disguise, a scruffy sailor's pea-jacket, a filthy scarf, and an unshaven chin. "How do I look?" he asked, clearly pleased with his transformation. "Like a lunatic," Poirot replied, reluctantly agreeing to adjust his appearance as well. "After all," he muttered, I cannot let a child dressed for charades wander off into Limehouse alone. The eating-house was a dim, grimy room, filled with strange, fragrant dishes and shifty eyes. Poirot and Pearson sat at a corner table, eating cautiously, while Pearson loudly played the part of a rough sailor, throwing around words like lubbers and foxels. Suddenly, the owner appeared, a Chinaman with an unsettling smile that barely reached his eyes. "You no likey food here?" he asked smoothly. "Maybe you like a better PC pipe?" Pearson's boot nudged Poirot under the table. "Aye, John, lead ahead." The man led them through a door, down a creaky trapdoor, and into a dimly lit opium den filled with low divans and thick smoke. Chinese boys moved silently, bringing pipes to the patrons. Poirot and Pearson pretended to smoke, playing their parts as weary dreamers, but once the room settled, Pearson whispered, "Follow me." Crawling on the floor, they moved through a maze of rooms until voices stopped them in their tracks. Behind a thin curtain, two men were speaking in low tones. "What about the papers?" one voice asked. "Mr. Lester, he takey those," replied another, distinctly Chinese. "Putty them alley in safe place. Policeman no looky there." Poirot's lips curled into a faint smile. The impersonator was instructed to pose as Wu Ling's servant. He would lure Lester to Limehouse under the guise of meeting Wu Ling. Once there, Lester would be offered a drink. Drugged, naturally. When he emerged an hour later, his memory would be hazy at best, his thoughts muddled. Perfect for Pearson's scheme. And it worked, almost too well. When Lester learned of Wu Ling's death, he panicked. He denied ever reaching Limehouse, exactly as Pearson hoped. But was Pearson content with that? "Non, Hastings. My presence unsettled him, my manner, and so he decided to solidify his case against Lester by drawing me into his web. He staged an elaborate charade, hoping to distract Hercule Poirot. Did I not say before, Hastings, that he was as a child playing charades? I played my part perfectly, letting him believe I was completely fooled. He went home triumphant, thinking he'd outwitted me." Poirot's eyes twinkled mischievously. But the next morning, who should arrive on Pearson's doorstep? "Inspector Miller?" Poirot spread his hands theatrically. The papers were found in Pearson's possession. The game was over. Ah, how bitterly he must have regretted trying to play the farce with Hercule Poirot. "And that was that?" I asked, feeling a twinge of satisfaction. Poirot raised a finger. "Not quite. There was one real challenge in this case." "What was that?" "Convincing Inspector Miller," Poirot said with a sigh, shaking his head. "What an animal, both obstinate and imbecilic. And yet, in the end, he took all the credit." "Terrible!" I exclaimed indignantly. Poirot smiled, his tone lightening. "Ah, but I had my compensations. The other directors of the Burma Mines Limited awarded me 14,000 shares as a small token of gratitude. Not bad, eh? But let me tell you, Hastings, when investing money, stick strictly to the conservative. The things you read in the papers, they may not always be true. Remember the porcupine directors? They may very well be another Monsieur Pearson." Poirot chuckled, but his warning lingered like a shadow in the air.